Welcome to our program, Online Safety, What to Look Out For to Protect Our Children. I'd like to begin the program by recognising the rich Aboriginal heritage of this country and acknowledge the custodians of all the lands from which we connect. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and are conscious that they have passed on to us their wisdom in various ways. So let us hold this in trust as we work to serve our communities. My name is Fatih Errol Tansa, and I am executive member of the Australian Cultural Society and a serious college parent, both of whom are the organisers of tonight's program. The Australian Cultural Society is a not-for-profit organisation that promotes multiculturalism and fostering intercultural and interfaith dialogue. They're certainly a catalyst for cultural and information exchange. The co-hosts Serious College is a private non-denominational school established in 1997, which has in excess of 3,000 students distributed across campuses in Keysborough, Broadmeadows, Dallas, Sunshine West and Shepparton. Serious College endeavours to provide a balanced education that encompasses both academic excellence and moral, ethical, social consciousness. Serious College is dedicated to nurture the new generation of tomorrow. The motto, Reach for the Stars, is used to emphasise the ultimate goal, which is educating, mentoring, and motivating the students to reach their future dreams. With no doubt, the future of our dreams are probably going to be assisted with the many technological advances we currently benefit from, such as e-technologies. Never has our civilization been so connected. Never has it been so easy to share data and information with one another instantly. And with this great resource comes great responsibility. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a substantial increase in screen time for children, as many are using the online platforms for remote learning. Children and young people use the internet for many reasons, but we know gaming, social media, and access to entertainment are some of the most popular reasons. The ever-growing online world can be an exciting place for children, but unfortunately, it can also provide an opportunity for online harms to occur. Gone are the days when your children would be outside playing, and once you shut the door at home, you could control who they were speaking to and who they communicated with. Digital online communication can be used by adults to manipulate, coerce, or exploit young people. It is important for adults to understand these harms so they can better educate and protect young people from what they may experience online. So we pose the question, what do we need to look out for to protect our children? Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to provide a quick reminder that you can engage in the conversation by asking your questions in the chat section. Our panelists are experts in their field, and it is certainly a privilege to have them join us tonight. Greg Gebhart is one of Australia's leading online safety presenters. Greg has provided presentations to more than 800,000 participants at state, national, and international events. He has a strong background in leadership and change and has held senior positions including regional manager for the Victorian Industry and Educational Partnerships Program and chair of his regional adult education board. Greg has been recognised for his achievements and passion for helping others, receiving a Global Achievement Award through the International Society for Technology and Education. Our second panellist, Associate Professor Michael Salter, is a criminologist and Scientia Fellow at the University of New South Wales, where he specialises in the study of child sexual exploitation and complex trauma. He is the author of 2 books and a range of papers on child abuse, complex trauma, and primary prevention, and he provides advice to government and non-government organisations in Australia and internationally. Dr. Jane Welsh has over 30 years policing experience serving the Victorian community. Dr. Jane Welsh joins us tonight as our third panellist, and she is currently Detective Superintendent in charge of the Cybercrime Division, which is part of the Crime Command. The Cybercrime Division is made up of the Cybercrime Squad and the Joint Anti-Child Exploitation Team. In her current role, along with responding to crime, Jane leads a program of work focused on building cyber capability across the organisation. Jane also represents Victoria Police on various national committees, which include law enforcement, government and industry. These committees focus on the development of nationally coordinated responses to cybercrime, including online sexual exploitation of children. Jane's qualifications include Doctor, Policing and Security, a Master's in Leadership and Management or Policing, and Master in Ethics and Legal Studies. So welcome to the panel. I'd like to start our program by asking, probably what is the most important question tonight, and that is, how do we keep our children safe? So Greg, I might ask you first. How do we keep our children safe?
Well, it's a good question, isn't it? We want to keep our children safe offline and online, and it's something that every parent wants. And I think it's really important that when we work with our children, we need to make sure that they're aware of the risk factors. So, most kids think that they're invincible in all parts of life, and making them aware of the risks online. We want kids to be critical thinkers so they can make good decisions when they're online. They understand what to put in place. So I think one of the things is to work with children. So that's probably more than just a parent, more than a school. It's really a community response that we really want young people to be supported so they know how to report. We want them to know how to block, seeking support around their well-being. And for parents, we've got to think about role modelling. I mean, you are the person they look up to, your practices, how you have conversations with children, how you communicate. So I think it's really about not just a parent, not just a school, but an entire community about putting those things in place. And the one thing I do want to say as I finish up this question is that most kids don't want something bad to happen to them either. We sometimes forget that kids want to be safe and have good experiences. Just the excitement of being in those things and the peer pressure means that those things don't often happen.
Certainly. And Jane, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, thank you. Look, I agree with everything that Greg has said. I think if we could use just one single word to best describe what's needed to keep children safe in an online world, and that's communication. And that's communicating with their community, their school, their friends, but perhaps most importantly for younger children, it's having open lines of communication at home. And the second part about it, if I were to choose two parts, the first would be communication, and the second would be the importance of parents to take the time to understand what the online world is like, how to get there, how to maneuver around it, just so when their children are speaking to them, they know what the children are talking about. It's incredibly helpful for the children to understand when I go to my parents for help, they know what I'm explaining to them.
Fantastic. And Michael, do you have anything to add as well?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's just worth putting this in context, which is, there's so much pressure on kids to keep themselves safe online and so much pressure on parents to keep their kids safe online. And one of the reasons for that is because these online platforms and services are so unsafe, that we've got huge social media companies that are encouraging kids to use their platforms and services. And, they're not keeping kids safe. And so the onus ends up being on kids and on parents. Now, that's the way it is at the moment. I don't think that's the way that it should be. When these platforms are making billions of dollars, it's not much to expect them to ensure that kids aren't going to be sexually exploited on their platforms.
So we talk about safety, but in talking about safety, I want to unpack what are the risks and how serious are they? So Jane, I might pose that question to you first, especially since you're with Victoria Police. Can you explain what those risks are and how serious they are?
I think the risks start very quietly and they present themselves, they move from the online world to the physical world very, very quickly. So the risks are about children being manipulated and being drawn into creating friendships and trusts in circumstances where they are being completely deceived. For the young mind, it's very, very difficult to understand sometimes who is trying to deceive them and who is not. And they can be very giving with their experiences, very, very keen, very excited at offers that can be made for them. And to say to a child sometimes, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, needs a lot more discussion for a young person.
And so how
that can be made
serious
for them, and to say true, it needs a lot
And how serious are those risks? If we were to look at data in Australia or overseas, is it something that we should, certainly be concerned about?
We should certainly be concerned about it. It should be at the front of our minds. It is a very real risk. It is a very real risk to the physical safety of children once they are drawn out from behind their computers into the physical world. It's not uncommon for young children to be drawn out to meet people who are disguised as somebody online. So that is where the risk of being tricked online is one thing. But once it leads into the physical world where children are then trying to meet those people, to receive a gift or to be given a promise that they had been given, is where the threat becomes very, very dangerous.
And Michael, from an academic perspective, I know you've looked at trauma with children, for example. Can you shed some light onto the risks involved there and the consequences, or how serious we should be taking those risks?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to think about. I mean, in terms of, from a research point of view, data suggests, and it's variable, but about 10 to 15% of teenagers will experience an unwanted online sexual solicitation. So this is an adult who approaches them sexually, and it's an attempt to lure or to groom them in some way. Now, most of those kids, it won't be effective. For most of those kids, they won't bite. Online offenders are often trying this hundreds of times a week and just trying to get one kid to trip up and make a mistake. So in terms of, if we're talking about sort of online luring and grooming, we are talking about kind of 10 to 15% of kids will experience some kind of direct solicitation. That's what the research suggests. In terms of online sexual harms, it's a little more broad than that in terms of sometimes peer-to-peer sexual harassment, requests for a naked image from a peer, for example. At that point, unfortunately but true, probably the majority of kids will hit the age of 18 where something's happened online sexually. Doesn't mean they've necessarily been harmed, but there's been some kind of intrusion into their interpersonal life. I mean, in terms of the impacts of this, it really is quite varied, and obviously varies according to the severity of the issue, and also how early the child's able to disclose and get help and support. At the really pointy end of this, where we have adult offenders who are luring, grooming, trying to get sexual material of the child, they may then blackmail the child using that material, or they may try and meet the child offline. I mean, that's where we are in situations that, this is going to change that young person's life. Is what this is. This can take years and years away from a young person. So I don't want to scare people, but certainly at the pointy end where we're dealing with trauma, self-harm, suicidality, it can get pretty scary. It doesn't have to get there if we can intervene much earlier and find ways to break the cycle.
Well, it's certainly a worry for parents because children today are spending so much time online. That's certainly, that's a question that pops up from time to time. But Greg, if I can ask you, because you run a lot of education sessions, training sessions, when you work with parents, do you feel they understand the risks, or how would you communicate those risks and the seriousness of them to parents?
Yeah, I think the really important thing is, was mentioned before by Jane, is for parents to try and get a bit of an understanding of the technology that young people are using. You look at the trending apps at the moment with TikTok and Discord, and we certainly know that there's lots of offenders live in those areas. There's a lot of fake accounts that can lure kids into those areas. So I think it's important that parents have a bit of an understanding. Now, one of the tips I would always give parents is when you have conversation with young people, try and include some of the good things about technology when you're talking about the negative, because the last thing kids want to hear is someone saying, don't do that, we're never going to do that, don't touch it. Recognize that, yeah, there's some risks and there's some dangers there, but thank goodness that you're able to contact your friends or kids with, issues that around their mental health and well-being are now using the internet continually to search for information and support. So we've got to be careful how we have that approach with kids rather than the traditional blocking and stopping, because there's a lot of support online, and I think for parents getting to really understand what sort of things there are. One of the things that we've tried to do on our website is develop lots of resources for parents, and the content in there I think can make a big difference for supporting parents. One of the biggest things we found for parents that was important was, how do you start the conversation? So how do you talk to kids about a sex offender or grooming? How do you talk to kids about pornography? How do you talk to kids about sending naked photos? And that's a real challenge. So we've developed some resources around conversation starters for teenagers on those difficult topics. But we also realise that kids in primary school are exposed to a lot of this as well. So we've got a set of questions for 11 and 12-year-olds. And we've got, again, a younger group, because it has to be age appropriate. We don't want to get them interested in content that we're talking about, or inquisitive. We don't want to scare them off in those areas. I think the other thing too that can really help in a lot of communities is we're now starting to produce a lot of content in different languages. So having it so that families where English is not the spoken language or the main language can make it a lot easier, and having booklets and information. It is really about the fact that, parents coming tonight, you've made an investment in your child's future. That's what tonight is, not a webinar, an investment.
So, Greg, you actually touched on a very important question, which I was planning to ask a little later in the program, but I think it's probably an opportune moment to ask now. And that is, you mentioned, having a conversation with children. And I want to ask you, can you provide us a snapshot? Because you said there's a lot of resources on the E-Safety Commission website, and there's a lot of work in that space. But if you had to summarize, the key approaches that a parent should have in having that conversation with children, what would it be?
Well, I probably talk a lot about how they felt rather than what they saw or what they're exposed to. So how did it impact you? What's your feelings? So you're getting into that emotional state for young people to sort of unpack what they've experienced. And sometimes we focus too much on just the content that they've seen or the person. It's the fact that, made you feel uncomfortable. It's maybe got in a situation where you don't have anyone to talk to. You feel embarrassed in those areas. So I think that's a really important part for the conversation, is not always focus on what the issue was, but how that issue made you feel internally in those areas. So it is a challenge for parents. And the other thing I'd suggest for parents, try not to sit at the table and look at each other face to face like we're looking at each other today. I can tell you that teenagers and even primary kids, they hate those hard to have conversations about intimate images or perhaps around pornography. They look at their shoes and it's hard to have a conversation. Side-by-side conversations, so you're not really making eye contact. If you go to if you walk the dog each night, and especially if the dog pulls, you've got to look forward all the time. You can't look at your child. Conversations in cars. So it's not just the conversation, it's the way you have the conversation as well.
So Jane, if I could also ask you, how would you recommend parents approach a conversation with their children?
Spending some time thinking about how you as a parent feel about this, because it is not a conversation that we would default to have with our children otherwise. For example, we may not choose to have a discussion with our 11-year-old about intimate images he or she may be producing of him or herself. So it is, I think the first thing for a parent to do is understand really clearly how they feel about this. What do they think the barriers are that they bring to the conversation about this? And I think once they have that very clear in their mind, it's much easier for them to communicate them, because they know what they're bringing to the table, and an understanding that by responding with aghast and things like that, things that would perhaps generate that feeling of shame in a child, will shut the conversation down very, very quickly. So I think the very first thing to be doing is understanding what is it that I am bringing to the table that will either be a barrier to this conversation or will be something that will enable the conversation.
And Michael, based on your research, do you have anything else to add to that? What are some of the key messages or key conversation starters that we can have with children?
I mean, I think, Jane's words here are really wise. There's a challenge about parents trying to set boundaries and trying to be clear about acceptable and unacceptable behaviour online, but then actually keeping that open dialogue, because often what offenders will do, the worst sorts of offenders will actually get a kid to breach to breach those rules, to break those rules. They'll get the kid to do something that makes the kid feel embarrassed or ashamed. They'll get them to do something that is against the rules. And then the child is afraid to tell the parent because they think they're going to get into trouble. And that's the leverage point that a lot of offenders use to actually kind of entrap the child in in an even worse scenario. So, there is Jane sort of said, we need to stop and sort of think about where we're coming from here. I think that's really important. Your child needs to know, and I think this is something you can say to a child, no matter what trouble you get into, no matter what happens, I'm on your team. I'm on your side. And it doesn't matter what happens, I will help get you out of that situation. They need that confidence, because if they're afraid to tell you about something, then they might just keep going along with it. And that's the worst case scenario.
I think every parent's intention is to, absolutely show their child love and open communication. But of course, with young people, sometimes we can't tell. We don't know how their minds work. And, when they're exposed to some of these harms, they might pull back, and they might feel like they can't share this information with parents. So I was wondering, what are some of the signs that parents can look out for? When should they be concerned or feel like something might be that they should follow up with something with their children? What signs should they look out for? Jane, can I ask you that question first?
I think as parents, we are quite, generally speaking, we're quite aware of our children's change in mood, and even the most subtle differences in the way that they're presenting in the home when their guard is quite often down. So I think that one of the very first things that we see when we speak to young people and their families who have been victims is that the child will become quite withdrawn and will pull away from family, so pull away from family engagements, and they are very, very conscious of their communication device, whether that's their phone or their computer, and they appear to be quite obsessive about what's happening. If it pings or goes off, they're very responsive to that. So those subtle changes in behaviour can speak very loudly to parents.
And Greg, when you're providing education classes and training parents, what signs do you ask them to look out for?
Yeah, I think Jane's spot on with what she said there. There's probably a few things I'd add to that too. Things like kids hiding things. So while they might pick up their phone, they might not read the text message. They might go to a bathroom, or they might go to a bedroom to read it. So a parent's not looking over the shoulder to see what's happening in those areas. And also looking at things like, that sort of shift in their behavior and personality. Sometimes we've got a list of all these different things, and people often say to me, which is the most important one? And I say, none of those in the list. It's gut feeling. If you're a parent and you think there's something wrong with your child, I'm going to say there probably is. It's a case of finding out what the cause is. But some things that you'll pick up, the bigger things, are probably that disengaging with family conversations, not doing schoolwork or not doing to the level they've done before, not visiting their friends, even if it's online, not spending as much time in that friendship group. Maybe sport or community or cultural activities have dropped off a bit in those areas. So I think really just look for those key things, as Jane said. If there's something that you notice that has changed, it's generally a great time to say, look, I've noticed this, because you've got something to lead in the question. Is there anything bothering you or concerning you at the moment that you can talk to us about? And it is about that conversation.
And Michael, I'd like to find out your thoughts on this as well, because sometimes parents might feel that their children are disengaging, but they might say, oh, it's their hormones, it's the teenage years, or they're just going through a rough patch, and this will build resilience. Is that a right way to think? Is there any relevance in that? And what, according to you, what are some of the signs parents should look out for?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one, because I don't think there's any obvious red flags, especially if the child is keeping the situation secret. And they might be doing that because they've been told to, and because they're afraid. We can also see kids, and I've seen more than one instance of this where the child actually goes back to be re-victimized. So the child, there's an incident that goes wrong and almost the child tries to kind of master it. They try and prove, I'm not embarrassed, I'm not humiliated, I'm not in control, by actually starting to engage online in a risky way or expose themselves online in a risky way multiple times. Because in a sense, I think they're trying to understand, they're trying to avoid the shame and the humiliation. And so I think it is a tough one. And ultimately it comes down to a few things. It comes down to trust, and trust is really important. I mean, I've worked with young people where their parents were so paranoid about online harms that their parents cracked down, read every email. They weren't allowed to have their own tablet. And actually that's a breach of the child's trust. The child doesn't trust you anymore. The child's not going to tell you anything because you don't trust them, basically. I've also seen cases where the parent pretty much had to knock down the bedroom door and hack into the computer to find out what had really gone wrong for their daughter. I'm not sure that I'm providing any clarifying information here, but I think just broadly, it is about that sensitivity that Jane and Greg are pointing to. It's about building up that trust and that inquiry, and sometimes acting on a hunch when you really feel like something's wrong.
You touched on some really important points, I think, Michael. You mentioned shame and humiliation. Now, it's probably a parent's greatest fear to come across some of that material. And so if their child was being, if they felt uncomfortable, if they were a victim of harm, for example, and parents came by that, sometimes they can feel shame and humiliation as well. And they can often think, it's probably best not to make this into a big deal. What would others think? The reputational damages for the family. So are these relevant concerns in your thought? And what's the cost of not following up on a concern? And when parents do follow up on a concern, are there any safeguards in place to protect anonymity, for example?
So I'm sure Jane and Greg can jump in with some useful advice there, but I think you're absolutely right. There are broader sort of social and cultural issues at play here, including in particular communities where, family reputation can be really, really critical. It can be important, not just socially, but even, from a business point of view. I remember working with a young person some years ago where actually something did go wrong online, and that had implications for her father's small business once the family knew, because it was a business that was really embedded in his community. But, as Jane said, we need to think about, what are we bringing to this conversation? What's the baggage we are bringing? And my challenge to parents is always, whose side are you on? It's your job to be on your kid's side. You are the only one that can kind of rescue them, and it is our job to do that. So I think we have to have some clear boundaries, not just for kids, but we need to have some clear boundaries for ourselves.
Certainly. So Jane, would you like to add to that?
Michael's absolutely right. It is about understanding what we as adults bring to this conversation and what might be holding us back, and really asking ourselves and answering very honestly, what is the outcome I am seeking here? And the outcome I am seeking is the safety and well-being of my child. And what am I prepared to give to get that outcome? What am I prepared to give up myself to have that outcome? So that's, I think, part of that very tricky balance between feeling a sense of personal shame for whatever reason that might be, and trying to get the best possible outcome for my child as early as possible.
And what about you, Greg? Do you have anything to add to that? Is there anything that parents can do to get rid of some of those concerns, or alleviate some of them at least?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that parents have to realise that young people are all connected to the internet. This can happen to anyone. So when you feel that shame about something happening, it's not because necessarily you've done anything wrong. It's just the situations and the places where young people are, and perhaps they just haven't taken the key messages that you brought across in there. What we do know, especially with cyberbullying, where about 1 in 5 children from 8 to 17 have been cyberbullied, is that the long-term implications of not doing something about it do definitely lead to mental health issues and well-being issues for young people over time. And I think that's with any online issue, is the long-term impact on your child. It's important to get something done. And I know sometimes it is difficult because people talk about that, and in small communities, everyone knows. But the important thing is that those communities are there really to try and support you as well. And I think that's important to go into your community and say, I need support in this area. The one other thing I do want to say, though, is when you get into situations like this, the one thing that's sometimes forgotten is self-care of parents. Because as an adult, you're in quite a stressful situation and you're reacting to something, and we're putting every safeguard in place for our child, and we're forgetting about our own well-being. So I think that's something you need to consider as well in those situations.
Certainly, that's a great point, Greg. But I just want to pose a scenario. So if there was a parent who, for example, came across an image or something on the internet that they were concerned about, what can they do? Are they able to remove that content? What can they do? Should they reach out to social media companies, or should they reach out to the authorities, for example? So Jane, I might pose that question to you first.
In the first instance, have a discussion now with somebody in the house. But also, I think who to reach out to in the first instance is often dependent on the circumstances about how that image was come across, what is depicted in that image, and various other things. So that will trigger a response. Do I go to the police, or perhaps do I make attempts otherwise to have that image taken off? So I suppose Greg might be in a good position in the first instance to talk about how we might remove that image.
So, Greg, if I can get you to explain.
Yeah. So with the work that we do, and as a government agency, federal government agency, we work really closely with state police and federal police in these. There can sometimes be a civil component and a criminal component. So as Jane says, we need to look at the context, the nuance, the circumstances and that. But generally, if something is on the internet, whether it's extreme content, violent, cyberbullying, whether it's explicit content, it should be basically reported to the social media platforms. Now, all these companies have terms and conditions and community standards, and they're pretty good at taking the stuff down. So they investigate, have a look at the content, and they generally remove it. Sometimes we find that they may not understand the nuance. So say someone who's a vulnerable child, it might be something that doesn't look serious, but it is quite serious for that child, may not get taken down because it technically doesn't break the terms and conditions because they don't have the concept or the content of where that's happening. So the important thing is, firstly, is to report to those companies, and hopefully they take the content down. As I said, they're very good at it, but sometimes things fall through the cracks. If it is something like cyberbullying or the harassment or the sexual harassment that's happening through bullying, then you can go to the e-safety commissioner, and we can help. But we need to have that report to the social media company first. Then basically, if it's not removed within 48 hours, you can contact us, and we'll look at the content. And if it meets the criteria of serious cyberbullying or harassment in that area, then we'll serve a notice to the company to try and get that content down. We will have new legislation in January, which will speed that up. So at the moment, they've got 48 hours to remove it. That'll shift to 24 hours to take down. But in the cases of intimate images that are shared without consent, which is what we call image-based abuse, you can come directly to us to have the content removed from a social media site or wherever. And again, the most important thing there is we work closely with the police, because there may be a case of preservation of evidence that we need to work with them, so we just don't take the stuff off if they're trying to find out who the person is. But certainly that legislation that we have in place, we have 3 reporting teams, one on cyberbullying and cyber abuse, another one on image-based abuse, intimate image, and the third one covers abhorrent content, but it also covers child sexual abuse material. So we work very closely with law enforcement. Our role is to try and get the content taken down, and if we get intelligence evidence, we'll pass that on to the police to do their part in trying to find the perpetrators. So some really good structures in place, and again, I think we're leading the world in being able to put that in place.
And Greg, just to clarify, so if parents wanted to report something that they're concerned about, in the frames that you mentioned, going online and Googling or searching for eSafety Commission would be the best way to go about it and report it online. Is that right?
Yep, if you type eSafety into Google, we should come up number one. You don't even need to put Commissioner in there. In the top right-hand corner of every page on our website, whether you're on a kid's site, parent site, whichever, the reporting button is there, and it gives you the ability to identify what the issues you want to report. And our team will be non-judgmental. If someone's sent an intimate image has been leaked out, we just want to get that content taken down and do the best for the young person in that area. So pretty simple to do, fill in the form, and then we'll look at it and we'll contact the person and see what other information we may need to put that in place.
Fantastic. And Michael, if I can ask you, what's your opinion on the timeframes, for example, when parents report or want content removed? Do you feel like social media companies, for example, they're quite responsible and they act in a timely manner, or are there issues that need to be addressed? Just wanted to know what your thoughts on that is.
Look, I would always go through eSafety. It's much more effective than contacting the social media company directly. Their moderation teams are not big enough. Certainly in my view, they are not moving fast enough. And also in my experience, we find social media companies acting very swiftly when a matter is escalated by the regulator. They are acting a lot less swiftly when it's just coming from the user. So, we're very lucky in Australia to have the eSafety Commissioner. It's a very unique agency globally, and there's a number of jurisdictions overseas looking at the eSafety model. So I think if you're here in Australia, then take advantage of what eSafety can do.
Fantastic. Jane, I'd like to ask you, it sounds like the eSafety Commission is just spectacular, and there's a lot of resources and a lot of material there to support families. But, many families might not know about eSafety Commission, and, they might not be live streaming with us tonight. So I'd like to ask you, if they were to come to Victoria Police and they had a concern, are there resources that they can tap into through Victoria Police? Is there any type of support that Victoria Police would normally provide when they're concerned about online content?
There is support, and we are doing as much as we can to keep police as contemporary as possible in relation to the support that needs to be given to families and victims. I think it's really important. It can be very confronting when these things happen, and knowing where to report, where do I go, what do I do? It can be overwhelming. So I think it's really an important message to come out of this discussion today, that I think the eSafety Commissioner is a really excellent first port of call. And if the eSafety Commissioner said, if it needs to go to the police, the process will be guided that way. But I think to simplify things in a situation that will feel quite overwhelming at the time, I think having a single advice for a single point of contact from which advice will be given, I think is probably the best message to take out of this today.
Interesting. And I might just use this opportunity to remind our viewers that you're able to engage with the conversation and ask questions. So if there's anything that you'd like to ask, please feel free to note it in the chat dialog box, and we can pick it up as part of the conversation. But I might go to one of the questions that have been asked, and that is, if the perpetrator is residing overseas, or if there's harmful content being posted by someone overseas, how does Victoria Police, for example, address that issue?
So those sorts of issues, when the offending is coming from overseas, we collaborate with the Australian Federal Police, who collaborates with international law enforcement. The collaboration across the globe has increased exponentially over the past few years. There is a lot more work that is happening across jurisdictions to try and identify people, identify images, and deal with that. I must say, though, it would be remiss of me to put a line under the difficulty involved in investigating these crimes. It is very, very difficult. It is very difficult to identify offenders. And when we take into account that they're often overseas and they are often using obfuscation techniques, for example, encryption and VPNs, so it's very difficult to know where they are actually located. It can be very hard. Police are having a lot more success more recently, and we have a lot more work to do. But at the moment, the key is collaboration and training our police to understand how best to investigate these crimes.
And Greg, do you have anything to add to that from an eSafety Commission perspective?
Yeah, we're part of an international network called the InHope Network, which is basically a lot of organisations like ourselves, not necessarily safety, but working in the field around child sexual exploitation material. And what we'll often do if we do identify that it's perhaps coming from a particular country, we can use those connections we have for them to do the investigations in the other areas. But as Jane said, it is extremely difficult. The end-to-end encryption has made it much more difficult. The virtual private networks, which are nearly embedded into computers nowadays, mean it's much harder to trace and track. But having that network internationally has been really important for us to try and take that next step in assisting anyone who makes a complaint.
Fantastic. I've just realised another question has come through, and that is, would a child be more willing to open up to their sibling, for example, as opposed to their parents? And how should a parent advise or support the sibling, I guess, in opening up to someone who might feel vulnerable? Michael, do you have any thoughts on that?
Look, I think generally kids do talk to kids. You know, there's less of a threat and there's sort of less of a risk of getting in trouble, to be honest. So, you know, we know that there are things sometimes that kids disclose just to friends. You know, that kids can disclose child sexual abuse to their friends, online abuse to their friends. And so, you know, certainly potentially a sibling. And I think, you know, there's some work that we can do around sort of improving what we sometimes call kind of bystander intervention, you know, for a kid, you know, what should they do if they hear something or see something where they're concerned about the safety of a sibling or they're concerned about the safety of a friend? And so I think those are some conversations that we can have just generally about, you know, in our family, or, you know, when you've got friends, what do you owe them? You know, how do you sort of show that you care about them? And sometimes that means telling an adult. And just being aware that, you know, kids will sometimes swear each other to secrecy, you know, can I tell you something, but don't tell anyone. And that those are sometimes not secrets that you should keep. There are certain secrets that you do need to take to an adult, and that's definitely one of them.
Fantastic. Yeah, and so Michael, just on that as well, you know, if there are children who are keeping secrets, and for example, it's playing on their mental health, and this is a long-term process. And there's another question online that's come through that sort of speaks to this. What are the long-term effects on the victim's mental health, and how do they re-engage with society? So what are some of the things that they can do or can assist them with?
I mean, the issue for the child is it's the anxiety. The issue is where online abuse is taking place and the situation is prolonged, so it's not brought to an end in a short period of time. The child is deeply anxious, deeply ashamed, deeply afraid. So these are the conditions for, yes, depression and anxiety, but these are the conditions for trauma. I mean, trauma is ultimately an anxiety disorder. So, you know, it's very disruptive to the child's psychological development. It can have physical effects if it goes on for long enough. I mean, I'm thinking of one survivor, and she's okay now, but she had a really tough, you know, her teen years were very, very tough. She just very quickly, but she got drunk one night. There was a boy that she wanted to be in a relationship with, and so on a webcam she took her shirt off, and she thought that was private and between them, and she thought that maybe he'd become her boyfriend, and that's not an uncommon scenario. Now, he actually recorded that and shared that, and then unfortunately that video then actually became quite widely distributed online for a number of years. And so, I mean, this was, her parents eventually were able to figure out what happened, but she kept this secret for a period of months, actually. Now she's okay, you know, she ended up going to uni, she's in her early 20s, she's okay, but she had a really tough 4 or 5 years. And she did need to get treatment, she did need to get trauma treatment, she did need to get mental health care, and she was unwell for a couple of years. You know, if this situation gets out of hand and the child is exposed for a long period of time to very high levels of anxiety and fear, I mean, that's terrible for anyone's mental health, but particularly for a young person.
You know, that example is interesting because you know, sometimes we find that in the school environment that material can spread very rapidly amongst the school community. So Jane, I might pose the next question to you, and it comes from online as well and it speaks to that. How much of this online grooming content has entered our education curriculum, and how are kids informed on what to do and where to go for help?
I think different schools deal with this differently at the moment. I know I can certainly speak from the police, Victoria Police point of view. We are doing a lot of work to get back into schools and start these discussions where we feel that there needs to be greater discussion and open dialogue with children. So I know that I can certainly say that police are doing a lot of work to get back into schools and to have these sorts of discussions about risk and threat online, amongst many other things for young people.
And Greg, do you do any work with schools in educating teachers or the school community on how to address these issues?
Yeah, we certainly do. Each year we offer a education professional learning program, which is at no cost at all. In fact, all our programs, all our resources are free, which is good news. But we do it's a 90-minute webinar. I did one tonight from 3:30 to 5 before we came here. And then there's some readings to get 2 hours of certified training. Some schools are having all their staff do that training as part of the component there. We also offer leadership programs in online safety within schools. We're doing sessions for mental health workers and school counsellors. We've also got sessions for chaplains around the National School Chaplaincy Program where they're being trained in mass to be able to provide support and assistance. And the other part, just coming back to our website, I mentioned before we had a lot of parent content. There's a lot of content for education mapped to the national curriculum. There's videos, animations and resources. But one thing we have put together is some age-appropriate landing places for young people to go to on our website. So there's a component for primary kids in primary school language. So, you know, someone's being mean to me or someone said something to me and they're a stranger, what do I do in that language? And then in our teenage section, the bit more hard-hitting questions that they told us that these are the things they struggle with, such as someone's been asking for nude photos and I don't know how to respond, or I seem to be playing games all the time. I don't want to keep doing it, but I don't know how to quit or how to manage my time. So we've developed resources for young people as well as the educators. And I think that's a pretty important thing, that we think about them having an entry point to get information, not just for us as adults to be able to continually give kids that. And I think what we really need to look for is young people who want to be the student voice of online safety, because kids will often listen to young people their own age and their peers. And that's a really important thing in schools, is to develop that capacity where young people can put some of those key messages, which parents, the school, or even organisations like our local police groups or eSafety can help train them up to be able to get that message into kids, and then they can be the voice of that online safety.
Yeah, I think one of the things you mentioned there about peers and young people, it's raised the question about bullying, for example. You know, sometimes there might be mates or there might be school friends who might engage in online conversations, which is bullying behavior, but it might just seem as, you know, friendly banter, but, you know, someone might be really, really affected by that. So how do you speak to those individuals, or how do you approach where there is an issue like that, where the vulnerable young person might not necessarily want to bring it up with their peer or the young person or the school, because they might be seen as someone who's dobbing in their friend. So what do we do in that situation, Greg?
Yeah, I think that's really about changing the culture in our schools and our communities, that it's okay. It's the right thing to do is stick up for your friends and to say something in those areas, and the right thing to do is make sure you're not exposed to these online harms. What we know from some research we just recently did around the digital lives of Aussie teenagers, more than 50% of young people said we would like more information about how to support our friends who are online having issues. And I think that's good news for young people to say, we not only want to support ourselves, but we do have this friendship and we do have this community that we're with, and we want to be able to support them as well. So I think it's important that we empower them. Michael talked about bystanders before, which is really important. We've gone a step further and we're tending to use upstanders more as the language. And generally bystanders will see things and say things. Upstanders will see things, say things and do things. And it's about making that next step in the difference in those areas. So I think that's really about getting that community together, getting young people to think about the issues. And again, as schools, how do we empower those young people to be part of changing the culture? And that's what it is. It's changing the culture about this is the right thing to do.
When we talk about changing the culture, sometimes parents might think, let the child develop some resilience. When we talk about these things where they might feel like they're being bullied, am I overprotecting them? Am I in some way preventing them from building some sort of resilience? Parents might have those questions, and they might think, let them experience a lot of these because they'll be facing this in the real world. There might be this kind of thinking. So, Michael, I was just wondering, what is your opinion on that? How do we approach the topic of bullying? Because it can be very difficult to define. And, what do you have to say to parents who think like that?
I think we expect kids to put up with things that no adult would ever tolerate. I work in a workplace of adults, and if they were bullied for a week, they would resign. If they were bullied for a year, they would mentally collapse. So we expect kids to just put up with things that we would never, ever tolerate as adults. And so we shouldn't be surprised to see that children are damaged by that. I think the term bullying really actually, underestimates what happens to kids. What we're talking about is long-term emotional abuse, physical assault, threat, fear. And the fact that it's happening from one 13-year-old to another 13-year-old doesn't make it any less real or any less serious. So, I think we just need to ask ourselves about, what's reasonable, particularly for children who don't have control over their lives. We make the decisions for them. If they don't like their peers, they don't get to just resign from school and apply to another school. They're often stuck there. And it makes their situation much worse and much more helpless. So, if resiliency is one thing, but prolonged abuse and maltreatment is another, frankly. So certainly we want to, engage kids in constructive problem solving. That's a key role of adults. Another key role of adults is to make sure that kids are okay, and that is our responsibility.
Jane,
I think it's really important to pause on this for just a moment. I think that the saying that I hear thrown around a lot about this is, what doesn't kill you will make you stronger. That is fundamentally flawed. What doesn't kill you could harm you for the rest of your life. And in the most extreme circumstances, this bullying does lead to children taking their own lives. So it is not a good tactic to say, just knuckle down, grit your teeth and get to the end of it. It is about engaging and speaking openly and saying, it's okay, I'm here, I'm at your shoulder.
Definitely. Fantastic. As a final question, I might ask the panel, in terms of primary prevention, if you had a final message to our viewers tonight, what would it be? And I might start with you, Jane.
Sit down with your young people in your home and watch this conversation with them. Great launching pad to start a conversation.
And Michael?
Criminal charges for social media companies that don't keep children safe, but that's a little beyond our power. This is about your relationship with your kids, and this is about making sure that they know that you're on their side. And I mean, you know, Greg and Jane have provided a lot of really practical advice about just getting to know their online life. What are the platforms? What, you know, you can participate in this, and it can be fun, and it can be something where you learn from them. But, you know, sharing that world with them is important.
Fantastic. And Greg?
Yeah, I think that conversation, I think what you've got is three presenters tonight who are all thinking exactly the same way about conversations with young people. Sometimes it's difficult for parents to bring those up. It's embarrassing for kids. It's difficult for the parents. But I think that's one of the real key things. The other thing I'd just like to say is it's never too young to start. And we have our early years online safety program is for 1 to 4 year olds. And the key message we push at that age at 2, 3 and 4, and it's the same message that we've talked about tonight with teenagers, it's okay to say no. It doesn't matter what age you are, it's okay to say no. And if we can teach those basic fundamentals from an early age, we're actually skilling up and empowering kids to make a difference.
Excellent. There's a lot of food there for thought for parents. And yeah, that would certainly be a good idea if parents can take the time to sit with their children and watch tonight's show. And in saying that, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for being with us tonight and sharing your expert advice and suggestions. And so I thank you. And just to inform our viewers, if you do want to have a look at the eSafety website, it's esafety.gov.au. So esafety.gov.au. And once again, I'd like to thank our viewers for joining tonight. Our next program will be on Wednesday, 23rd of November, and that is Conflict and Cohesion, Islam-West Relations in the Last 2 Decades. And that will be hosted by John Cleary, former ABC broadcaster. And our guest will be Professor John Esposito, who is the director, the Bridge Initiative and Centre for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. So as the Australian Intercultural Society would like to thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you.